Okay, good afternoon, everybody. And we're going to carry on our discussion about tools, tool marking. If I can get back to where I'm supposed to be, there you are. And I believe this is where we finished off last time. We've been talking extensively about firearms and ammunition. Just a word about how things like a firearm are collected at the scene of a crime. First of all, the overriding importance in dealing with firearms is to realize that they may be loaded and ready to fire. And so all precautions need to be taken to ensure that there's no accidental discharge of the firearm, either at the scene while it's being collected or during transport. Usually means putting on the safety, etc., or even taking out ammunition to ensure that there's no accidental firing. Whatever is reasonable in dealing with it must be done. When a firearm is collected, unlike the Hollywood pictures where the detective always puts a pencil into the trigger guard and lifts the gun up, that is not done. You will recall that there may be evidence on the gun, and there may well be evidence inside the gun, in the barrel. And that trace evidence could fall out. And all precautions need to be taken to ensure that any evidence on the gun is available. So the gun may be carefully moved, either by grasping it by the trigger guard or by a part where no fingerprints or evidence is likely to have accumulated, like on the butt of the gun where it's marked with checkers, anything like that. And as far as possible, the gun is moved in the orientation in which it was lying, for example, until you put it onto something or onto a piece of paper or whatever, or inside the evidence bag, so that any trace evidence that falls off is there ready to be visualized. So the gun was also inspected, and all the information about the gun that is visible is noted. If it's a revolver, for example, it's how many bullets have been fired, where the current bullets are in the chamber, etc. It may also be easy to see an identifying mark on the gun, an identifying number, and a note would be made of that. And the gun is carefully marked for identification, often with a plastic tag through the trigger guard. And then the gun is a piece of evidence. It enters into the chain of custody and is usually boxed or bagged for transport. In addition, of course, there may be other things like bullets, cartridge cases, shotgun shells, or whatever. Each of those is a piece of evidence. Each needs to be packaged properly in a properly labeled evidence container. But a lot of the associated evidence, especially trace evidence, may be fragile. For instance, there may be fingerprints on a bullet casing. And the bullet casing needs to be handled very carefully so that fingerprints are not smudged or lost. And in addition, the striations that we talked about before, those are easily deformed. And so a bullet casing, for example, will often be wrapped in tissue paper, placed in a box or something like that, padded so that it doesn't rattle around during transport and have the striations deformed. All legal guns, all legally produced guns, are identified by a unique serial number. And whenever that gun enters into a commercial transaction, whenever it's sold, or indeed, even if it's given as a gift or whatever, by law, a record has to be kept on the license of the number and who is in possession of the gun with that number. And that is so that the gun can be traced through its entire provenance from the manufacturer, through the retailer or whoever sold it, through all subsequent sales. Much the same as you would do with a car, with the vehicle identification number, the VIN number of a car, which is used to identify that particular vehicle on all licenses and everything else pertaining to the car. Same with the gun. Because of the importance of that serial number in being able to trace the history of a gun and who last legally owned it, at least. Criminals will often try to get rid of that number, and they will attempt to scratch it off, hit it, deform it in such a way that the number appears to disappear. But the fact of the matter is the metal that makes up a gun is actually very hard. And when that number is punched into the metal of the gun to mark it with its serial number, a tremendous amount of force has to be used. And it doesn't just print the number on the very surface. It actually deforms the metal for a considerable depth below the serial number. And even though it may appear that a number has been obliterated, if you strip off the surface layers of metal, it is often possible to see the number in the deformation of the metal below. And this is done serially usually with acid, carefully, layer by layer by layer. Metal is stripped off so that the obliterating marks are removed, and then hopefully the numbers will appear from underneath. There's a very short little movie here for you to watch, which will show you exactly how it's done. But here is an example. And this gun, they had attempted to file off or sand off the identification number here, and the gun technician here has stripped the surface layers of metal, and the number has reappeared, and it's here. It's quite easily visible, A70100081, and that, of course, you can then go to a registry and see exactly who has ever owned that gun. And there should be police records, for example, if the last owner had reported a theft or something, and the gun had entered into illegal possession, at least you know that is the location of the theft, etc. Or you can trace exactly who has owned the gun when by looking at the serial number. Okay, so that kind of concludes our discussion about guns and ammunition for the moment. We'll talk a little bit more about ammunition when we talk about explosives, about fire and explosives. And we'll hear a bit more about the explosives that are used in ammunition. But for the moment, we want to just talk about other kinds of mark that can be used in forensics. And in all of these cases, we're going to see that the same kind of examination is often made. We have a question mark that becomes extremely useful when we can compare it to a suspect, to a test mark. So, for example, a shoe print at a scene of a crime. If we have a suspect's shoe, we can compare the two marks to see what the similarities are. Any tool may leave a mark. A tool mark is any cut, any impression left by a use of a tool. And it's made obviously when the tool comes into contact with another object. So there are simple examples. I've already given you one. The shoe print is a tool mark. The shoe is nothing but a tool. But real tools also leave marks. As a burglar prying open a door or a window uses something, uses a chisel or something like that, a piece of metal. That is a tool, and that tool is likely to leave marks where they've applied force to a window. But similarly, a knife or something like that is also a tool and may also leave marks, which can be tied back to the tool itself. And the reason for that is that all tools carry with them individual mark. They carry marks, first of all, from imperfections acquired during the manufacture, just as we saw with the barrel of a gun. In manufacture, there are small imperfections which happen at random, and that is imparted to the bullet. Here, with a tool such as a chisel or something like that, there are small imperfections which have arisen due to manufacture, which may be imparted to a mark that the tool makes. And furthermore, as that tool is used during its lifetime, it acquires damage at random. And those marks, those characteristics may be imparted to a mark which that tool then makes. And if we have a suspect mark, if we have a questioned mark which has been found at a crime scene and a suspect tool, we can compare the question mark with the suspect tool. So, for example, here's a chisel which has been used. And you can see, here's the edge of the chisel there, the metal. So first of all, in the manufacture of the tool, there is imperfection. There's different, this metal has at some point been melted and poured into a mold and then beaten into shape. And there may be areas, for example, which are harder than other areas. Those areas that are harder tend to preserve better. Have a look here. Here, these may be tied to ridges of harder, slightly harder metal behind. But when we look at this edge, it is not just a straight edge with no character. It has acquired bumps and ridges, which are individual to that tool. Only that tool has those marks. And when this tool makes a mark on another surface, at a window, in putty, whatever, or unfortunately, in some circumstances, in a bone or something like that, it may leave a mark whose characters can be traced to these imperfections, as here. So at a scene, where a tool mark has been made, like at a window or wherever, as far as possible, the entire object needs to be collected. That may not always be practical, but it may be possible, for instance, to cut out a section of window or whatever and send that entire to the lab as carefully as possible so that the marks on it are preserved. Otherwise, if that is not possible, then some other method of recording that mark needs to be made. So, for example, a cast can be made in dental cement or an epoxy or something like that in order to get a cast of the mark for comparison to a suspect tool if it ever should be found. When a suspect tool is found and a comparison needs to be made between the question mark and the suspect tool, then the technician can proceed in the same way as we did with examining marks in the gun. You can do a test mark with the suspect tool. And the test mark can then be compared to the mark recovered at the scene, the suspect mark. Again, we can use something like the comparison microscope and see if see the degree of similarity between the marks and make a supposition about whether or not a particular tool made a particular mark. Now, there's one thing you might think would be tempting to try, And that is perhaps you have a tool lying at a crime scene and you have marks made on a window, and the temptation might be to pick up the tool immediately and see if it fits those marks. This is not done under any circumstances. The tool must never go anywhere near the marks, the suspect marks, the question marks rather, because then you run the possibility of actually altering the marks. Say, for instance, you see a tool lying at a crime scene and there are marks on a window, and some inexperienced investigator picks up the tool and tries to fit the tool to the marks. Well, in doing so, they could well create marks themselves, and all the evidentiary value is then lost in a court of law. If on cross-examination, it turned out that somebody had done that, the value of the evidence is entirely lost. So instead, that matching is done under laboratory conditions, under strictly controlled conditions. In addition, quite apart from that, something like a tool and the tool marks themselves may be carrying trace evidence. There may be all sorts of things. There may be hair, there may be paint chips or whatever on them, which also need to be examined and collected as evidence. Now, it may sound strange to say it, but in actual fact, the teeth are themselves tools, right? They are tools. They're tools that we use to eat. And teeth themselves, if we just think about the structure of our teeth and what happens to us during our life with our teeth. Our teeth, first of all, are individual to us. Their placement in our mouth is determined, first of all, by genetics, but also by circumstance, by the structure of the jaw. The teeth actually move in your jaw, and they move to positions which are more or less set as an adult, or they're still not absolutely set. But the position of our teeth, and then all the damage that we accumulate on our teeth, the chips, the loss of teeth, etc., etc. These are individual characteristics to a particular person. And it is possible, especially during a violent crime, that a perpetrator first of all, that a perpetrator may bite a victim, but second of all, also that a victim may bite a perpetrator. And just kind of as a hypothesis, we could hypothesize that a bite mark will bear a relationship to the structure of the teeth that produced it. That we could take a bite mark and then view that as being a questioned mark, and then compare it to the standard, the suspect tooth structure, and make a match. Well, bite marks can also be left on things like food. There's a famous case which was solved by one of the perpetrators having chewed into a big wad of chewing gum and spat it out at the crime scene and left perfect impressions of their teeth in the chewing gum. So there is a temptation to look at this almost the way that we would look at fingerprints, right? The tooth structure, damage of the teeth, etc., etc., is very, very individual to a particular person. And the bite mark is a record of that tooth structure, and the two can be put together, and a degree of similarity can be assessed. Well, bite mark evidence had a heyday when it became very, very popular to bring in forensic odontologists. Forensic odontologist is a dentist who specializes in the use of teeth and bite marks, etc., in solving of crime. For a long time, bite mark evidence held tremendous amount of weight in courts of law. And there were many cases which were resolved and resolved with a guilty plea often as a result of bite mark analysis. Just think of it two ways, operating both ways. If the perpetrator bites the victim, then the perpetrator places themselves solidly at the scene of a crime, right? Because they've bitten the victim. On the other hand, if a victim bites a perpetrator and that bite mark is seen during examination of a suspect, probably soon after the crime, then that solidly, no matter where the perpetrator is, that solidly ties their association with the victim. It's circumstantial. The bite could have arisen some other way, but it is very powerful, a very powerful means of tying the two together. Unfortunately, it has transpired, especially with the use of DNA, which has been used to resolve many disputed cases. It turns out that bite mark analysis is very, very subject to subjective judgment by the person doing the matching. The reason for this is that skin is not a particularly good recorder. It's not going to record the fine detail. It is actually records quite a crude record of the mouth, of the teeth and the mouth that bit. And it turns out that in many cases, the subjective nature of the judgment swayed forensic odontologists to make a much firmer association between the bite and an individual than was warranted. And there have been many cases now which have been thrown out on the basis, for example, of DNA evidence, where the bite mark evidence had played a tremendous role in convicting somebody. So this is a very, very important. And this applies to all of these ways that we use of doing pattern analysis. It's called pattern analysis because we take a pattern, a question pattern, and we compare it to a control pattern. We do it with fingerprints. A question latent fingerprint is compared to an individual's fingerprint. And the expert doing the comparison makes a judgment as to the degree of similarity or difference in deciding, is that question fingerprint from the person identified as a suspect. The same sort of thing applies with the bullet striation analysis. That's also pattern analysis. So is bite mark analysis, is pattern analysis. And we have to be aware of the fact that ultimately all of these things come down to a judgment on the part of the person doing the pattern analysis as to the degree of similarity between the two, between the questioned and the standard. It turns out that in bite mark analysis, there is just too much variability. It is still used. It is still used, but it does not hold the weight that it once did. So I want you please, at the end of this class, I want you to please read this, watch this movie, which is called False Positive. And False Positive will explain to you just how wrong things can go sometimes. Okay, so the same kind of pattern analysis can be done with many other kinds of impressions at a crime scene. So, for example, there are many things which will leave a print of themselves: shoes, tires, even things like fabric. For example, if somebody is wearing fabric and it gets blood on it and they lean against a wall or something, it can leave a print. And all of these can be analyzed and can be used as evidence. Whenever such a print is present, it has to be regarded as being extremely fragile. So they have to be very carefully treated. They can easily be destroyed. So very often extensive photographing will be taken of those impressions, and it will be taken under different kinds of lighting, together with a scale. In cases where the print itself cannot be lifted, say something on a fabric or a shoe print on a wall, let's say, and they kicked a wall or whatever, and you can't actually cut out the print. That print can be photographed with a scale, and we can then use the photograph to do a comparison if it's a high quality enough photograph. And the photographer has to be very skilled and has to make sure that it is completely in focus, that it features even the very smallest details for comparison, because we're going to do the comparison in much the same way we did with fingerprints. And that is, there's a gross overall patterns which tell us things like, say, for a shoe print, might tell us the make and the model of the shoe. But to tie a shoe print to a suspect shoe, what the examiner will look at are the things that make it individual, the markings on the sole that may give it individual character and allow it to be tied to a particular sole on a particular shoe. In some cases, these prints can actually be collected, as we'll see in a minute. But in cases where they cannot be collected, they are very carefully photographed. Sorry, I just need to check that I've covered everything. Okay, so there are various ways in which we can start to enhance faint prints, for example. It all depends on how that print has been made, what it has been made in. For example, the print may be made in a body fluid like blood. There may be other aspects to the print which allow it to be chemically enhanced in order to be collected or photographed. And in addition, we may be able to actually lift a print in much the same way as we did with fingerprinting. They can be lifted with adhesive tape or whatever for future examination. So here's what I mean by the individual nature of a print. This is a shoe print, and this is an impression of a shoe found at a crime scene. So this is quite a clear print. As this has probably been collected and moved to the laboratory, but if not, it could have been enhanced and it could have been photographed and the photograph used. But what the examiner is doing here, this pattern is an overall class characteristic. This pattern is decided by the manufacturer. It may be very useful. It may be able to allow us to identify the shoe and even the model or the date of manufacturer, et cetera, et cetera. The manufacturer would be able to tell you that. But that is a class characteristic. There may be many shoes that have this pattern. It doesn't tell you a lot, not necessarily. In one or two cases, in some famous crimes, it has, where people have had exclusive sneakers, for example, and only a few were manufactured. Then that class characteristics turned out to be very important. But in most cases, there'd be many sneakers or shoes with this kind of patterning. The examiner is looking here for minutiae, just as we did with the fingerprints, looking here for small marks that this sole has acquired during the time of its wearing. It may have some marks which are present from individual markings from manufacture, from faults in manufacture, that they do apply as well. but very importantly, it has acquired damage. And that this shoe print here can now be compared should we end up with a suspect shoe. Here is the suspect shoe, and the print has been made under controlled conditions. And the expert has now compared what the minutiae that they can see on the sole with those on the controlled print, and has arrived at, I can't quite see the, I think there's 14 or 15. And they can now come to court, show both of these pictures, show these similarities, and explain that these are individual characters. They are acquired at random by the wearer of this shoe. And this, they show that this sole, that this print, sorry, was made by this sole. And that is extremely powerful evidence. However, right at this point now, I want to point out to you, who says how many similarities there should be before we can say this suspect mark was made by the shoe that made this control print? Well, there isn't anybody. There's no scientific way of determining that. We saw much earlier in this course, we discussed that. We discussed how it's very difficult to put a statistical bound on this and say statistics tells us that this is the same as that. There's no such statistic. It just comes down to a weight of judgment. In this case, the examiner has thought that 14 similarities are sufficient to tie them. A defense attorney might question that and say, who told you that only 14? You know, can we say scientifically that this? In the case of fingerprints, this actually has become a major issue, as we'll hear later on in the course. I have a very important movie to show you, that this has become a major issue. How many points of similarity or difference do we need to state that our questioned object and our standard object are tied together? And in the case of fingerprints, it has been accepted 15 to 20 similarities, minutiae, are sufficient. That is now changing, believe it or not. And we're now heading towards wanting, in these kinds of pattern analyses, to have a much higher number, to be absolutely sure that that our finding is incontrovertible. Other patterns can arise from things you might never dream of. For example, here's a hit and run accident that struck somebody who was wearing jeans with the studs, these here. You know how the studs have writing on them there. Well, they hit this person with sufficient force that these studs in their clothing left marks on the fender. And not only that, it was such force, if you look very carefully, you can actually see the writing around the edge there. And this is very powerful evidence that this vehicle was involved in striking the person wearing these particular clothes. I would say it's probably not incontrovertible, but it's certainly very powerful circumstantial evidence that there is a link between this fender and the person that was wearing these clothes. It's just another kind of pattern that has arisen. Okay, so here's some of the ways in which these impressions can be treated at the scene of a crime, how they can be processed, developed, and lifted, etc. It just a lot depends on what material makes up the print. So very often, for instance, if somebody has broken into a house or whatever and has clambered over furniture, they may leave impressions in the dust, and they may leave impressions by lifting the dust, lifting dust off and leaving essentially a negative impression. Those can be lifted, and they're easily lifted by placing electrostatic film over the dust. That will actually attract the dust and it'll stick to the film, and you can then lift it. But they can also be lifted by using an adhesive film, rather in much the same way as we did with fingerprints. The faint prints can be enhanced. This here's a footprint here, very difficult to see. You can see that there's a footprint. This is a lesson in how carefully an evidence technician or lawmakers in general have to actually treat a crime scene. Evidence may be extremely difficult to see. And this is one of the reasons, for example, the first responder, first law enforcement responder will try to establish a likely route where a perpetrator has entered and left the scene of a crime to ensure that nobody walks over it. And they may, in fact, even bring in plastic bricks to make a walkway, for example, to ensure that this kind of very faint evidence is not disturbed. And this can be enhanced. Here has been enhanced with a chemical called bromophenol blue there to bring up that footprint. That can be photographed. It's good enough to be photographed, or they can then photograph it, then make some attempt to lift it. If the lifting does not work, which it sometimes does not, then you've got a good photographic record. And here is the scale to make sure that when you produce a photograph, you can produce it exactly the same size as the footprint, the original print. Here is a print in blood. Again, extremely faint. And you can see it's on a carpet, and it appears that there's you can just see an outline sort of thing, very faintly. It doesn't look like there's any detail there at all. But when we enhance that, there is a specific enhancer called luminol, which can be sprayed on blood, and wherever hemoglobin is present, it will fluoresce under ultraviolet light. When you do that, you can take a very good picture here of that impression. And in fact, there is probably sufficient detail here that an analysis of that sole could be done. And again, you could try and lift this as well. But more likely your photograph here in this case would be. So there is a movie specifically dealing with shoe prints. Shoe prints are very important because they're very frequently left. Obviously, people walk in and out of the crime scene, and they are usually wearing shoes. If they're not wearing shoes, they may leave footprints. But this is one thing that examiners do look for is footprints to use. Here's a case for you that was solved, giving a good example of the use of these prints in order to solve a crime. Where people have walked in soft soil, clay soil, or something like that, or even in snow, they may leave behind indented impressions of the shoes. This is also very important for making impressions of tire prints. Tires very often, because of the weight of a car, of a vehicle, they will often leave a print, and tires, motorcar tires, just the same as the sole of a shoe, motorcar tires may acquire individual characteristics. But apart from that, motorcar tires, there are many, many, many kinds of motorcar tire, and they can be identified by their tread. And this often provides very useful information. Because there are so many of them, it actually becomes, it's a tedious task, but it becomes useful very often to trace those those retailers who sell those particular tires, because they may have a record of who owned the vehicle that the tires were on. And that at least allows you to pare down a group of suspects and begin to examine, and then you can examine the tires or the soles of shoes for individual markings, which link the two. If a print has been left in soil, for example, as here, that a cast can be made, a wall of some sort is put up around it, and a casting fluid, plaster of Paris or dental plaster or something like that, is poured in, and it is sufficiently liquid that it will record all of the features of the print. This can even be done in snow or in like that. And it is another reason why at a crime scene, a perimeter is set up around the crime scene. Shoe prints and footprints are often extremely important. Okay, so as I've told you, all of the things that we've talked about, these are all aspects of pattern recognition: fingerprinting, bullet marking, bite marks, the tool marks we talked about today, and then also things like hair and fiber analysis, which we have not yet talked about. Shoe prints, all of these things, we're relying on the human eye eventually to make a determination. Are there sufficient similarities and differences that we can actually say, we can actually establish a relationship between a questioned print or questioned marking of some sort and an actual object, and it's probably its ownership. But unfortunately, as I've pointed out, there is no true scientific basis to this. This is not really open to the kind of experimentation that normally determines a scientific finding. It's just that we try to establish sufficient similarities, for example, that in overall human judgment, it seems very unlikely that an association cannot be made between a print and an object, for example. But unfortunately, errors can and they are made. So I'm leaving you a little bit of time today, and then you can also use some time on Friday to view these movies. The first was the movie on the shoe prints. That was one. And then this one here is called False Positive, and it will give you a good idea about the caveats that should be attached to pattern analysis in general. Okay, please don't forget, you have your second test is on Wednesday. Okay, and that, yes, on Wednesday. And that test is to be taken during the class period. That is 4 o'clock. Exactly the same format as your previous test. And I have sent out an email to you previously. Please look through your emails, giving you exact details about the test, about which chapters it covers. It covers up till the end of today, all right? And then I will send you some information on Wednesday also about Friday's class, all right?